Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about the respiratory system. We're going to talk about your airways, your lungs, and all the functions you need to keep breathing. Generally in medicine, we break up the system into two basic areas. We talk about the upper and the lower airway. The upper airway is everything above the larynx, as you can see in this image, and the lower airway is everything below the larynx. The larynx is, where your voice box is, so you get a rough sense that that's about right here. So that means that we're going to begin by talking about your nasal cavities, your upper airway, and then we're going to get into your lower airway, your lungs, etc. But keep those terms in mind because it'll help you make sense of the conversation we have related to this. So, upper airway. Well, the upper airway might be considered sort of relatively uninteresting, but I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the sinuses. The sinus cavities, what we call the nasopharynx, which is the part just after the sinus cavities as the air starts going down into your oropharynx, which basically is that airway that goes through your mouth. Okay, why do I want to spend time talking about that? Well, because it's relatively amazing. That is to say, when you breathe, the vast majority of the times you're breathing through your nose. We are nearly requisite nose breathers, which means that even if you think that you have your mouth open a lot, the reality is that 90+% of the air you breathe is going through your nose. And the reason for that is a much more functional and desirable way to breathe. If you had your nose entirely clogged up, and I know at times you feel you have a cold or something and your nose is a little bit clogged, but if you had your nose entirely clogged up, you couldn't stand it for more than a day, frankly. Your airway would get very dry, your lungs would get stressed, all kinds of nasty things would happen. So we basically are nose breathers. One of the reasons for that is that every day you breathe in somewhere around 20,000 liters of air. 20,000 liters of air is a lot of air. And your sinuses don't just sort of bring that to your lungs. That's not their principal goal. Your sinuses clean all that air, moisten all that air, and warm all that air to lower the stress that would otherwise be on the rest of your airway and your lungs. Imagine if you were breathing in on a 5-degree day through your mouth. You might do that short term, but long term, that's really going to dry out and stress your lung tissue. And the same thing would be true in terms of the dryness of air or all the particulates and pollutants and possible pathogens that are in air. In other words, you need your sinuses, you need your sinus cavities to clean, moisten, and warm things. How does that happen? Well, basically, that happens through the construction of an elaborate set of pathways through your sinus cavities before it gets to your nasopharynx, which brings it back down into your airway. We talk about these as conchae, and the conchae are basically long, narrow, curved shelves of bone that protrude into your nasal cavity and sort of create spaces that disrupt flow. In other words, instead of having airflow go smoothly through your sinuses, it gets twirled around and spun around in these twisted cavities. The intent of that is to create some turbulence that will separate out particulates in the air. What do I mean by particulates? Small little bits and pieces of stuff. It could be pollen, it could be dust, it could be diesel fumes, it could be pathogens, it could be viruses, it could be bacteria, etc. You get the idea. All of this, ideally, we'd like filtered out relatively early before it hits your sensitive lung tissues. So that is what's happening in your nasal cavities, is we've got all these little twisted open spaces that spin up the air and basically cause the particulates to separate out, and then that space is covered in a mucous membrane. That is to say, it's covered in specialized cells and tissue. The cells are called goblet cells that produce that sticky substance, those boogers, that sticky substance that covers this whole surface area and traps all those particulates. So your nose is actually highly functional and elegantly designed in that it takes all these particulates and possible pathogens, possible disease-causing problems, spins them around, separates them out, sticks them to goopy, sticky substance on the surface, and then in that chamber, which we sometimes call, by the way, the meatus. Meatus is just a term for the open pathways. You might see it, I think, if you look online and start searching for some of this. But basically, it's just another term for the open pathways in the sinuses. So it goes through those meatus and basically gets filtered out. And then all the particulates get stuck to the goopy, boogery substance. That then drains back, as you know, through your nasopharynx, down your throat, and into your stomach, where it encounters highly acidic stomach acid and gets dissolved harmlessly. So this system is basically designed to take care of possible pathogens that would be in your airway. Okay, I mentioned before the goblet cells. These are specialized cells in that tissue that are creating this thick, tacky mucus, sticky mucus. In addition to that, so far what I've described sounds interesting, but it wouldn't be nearly as effective if we didn't have another aspect to those walls. Not only are they covered in a mucus substance, but they're covered in cilia. And cilia are like short, microscopic, vibrating hairs. Imagine like a microscopic shag carpet. This does two things. The first thing it does, which is critically important, is these hairs move and therefore migrate things out of your airway. So this is like a shag carpet covered in mucus that is trapping particulates, and then through the movement of the shag fibers, of these cilia fibers, moving it down back again toward your stomach to be disposed of with your highly acidic stomach acids. In addition to that, the cilia have the effect of dramatically increasing the surface area. Here's an image that shows you what those cilia look like, and you can see like it basically looks like a thick shag kind of carpet, right? At the microscopic level, of course. So these are very, very tiny fibers. But they also have the effect, I was going to say, of dramatically expanding the surface area. So the reason we have these conchi, the reason we have all these open little pathways is to create a lot of surface area, because the more surface area, the more effective we'll be at trapping the particulates, right? But that's still not enough surface area. So the cilia effectively expand the surface area. Again, think shag carpet, right? If you've got just a basic floor, it's not much surface area. But if you covered in shag carpeting, then all the surface area of every strand of that carpet ends up being surface area that could trap particulates. So by some estimates, the total surface area of our sinus cavities, if you include the surface area of all the cilia, is somewhere around 1,000 square feet. That is a large surface area to trap a lot of particulates. And of course, to understand that, you have to look at the microscopic level to look at that tissue and to look at that cilia. But now you have a sense of the work that your sinuses are doing. So these convoluted cavities create this complex pathway to bring air into your lungs. It gets pre-moistened, it gets filtered, it gets warmed. When you exhale, by the way, these cavities also have the capacity to reabsorb some of the moisture. Remember, inside your body, real moist. Outside your body, not necessarily moist. So you can lose a lot of moisture just by breathing. In fact, on a dry, sunny day, a large chunk of the moisture you are losing that makes you thirsty or possibly makes you susceptible to dehydration is basically through the act of breathing. You're breathing out humid air, you're breathing in dry air, so you progressively get more and more dry, as all your tissues have to be re-moistened in order to keep your insides moist, right? Well, the sinuses retract some of that moisture as you're exhaling so that you don't lose all the moisture every time you take a breath. That, of course, is a key function as well, and it'll reduce your possibility of dehydration and drying of the sinuses and drying of the airway, etc. So I hope you realize now that actually those sinuses are kind of complex and interesting things. They aren't just sort of open pathways into your lungs, but they have a specific property to them. And again, filtering 20,000 liters of air a day, they are working hard. So they're constantly actually regenerating, cleaning themselves. And this leads to an answer to a couple of questions you've never had, but you should have had. One is, why is one of my sinuses always clogged up? In other words, if you check at any given point in your day, the reality is that you're probably breathing through one of your nostrils and not the other of your nostrils because one of them is clogged up. They take turns. Basically, they create an inflammation, a fluid buildup that flushes out the sinuses, that allows the tissue to regenerate. And when that's happening, that sinus really isn't all that functional. That nasal cavity, I should say, isn't all that functional. But the one on the other side, the other nostril, is. So at any given point in the day, you probably have only one nostril that's really functional. You may have noticed at some point, you might have thought that there was something wrong with you, you had bad allergies or whatever, because you might have noticed that, gosh, no matter what time of day it is, no matter when it is, one of my nostrils is always clogged. Yep, that's true for most people, and that's true most of the time. Having said that, if there's a time when you're breathing out of both your sinuses, both your nostrils, great. And if there's a time when they're both clogged up, well, that happens too. But again, this is part of the regeneration and cleaning process that's happening in your sinuses. The other question you might have is, why do my sinuses always run when it's cold? Are there more particulates and therefore my sinuses have to wash out when it's cold? No, usually when your sinuses are washing out pathogens and particulates, they're doing it the other way. They are drawing it back into your airway and into your stomach, which is more effective than letting it drip down your face, obviously. However, in really cold weather, the cilia slow down. Remember I told you that one of the really functional elements here is those cilia moving actively to take particulates and contaminants and move them through a controlled method through your airway into your stomach. But they slow down when it's cold. And as a result of that, that mucus will start dripping forward because the cilia aren't as effectively moving it back. That should answer your question about why your nose runs when it's cold. But the reason I want to point it out is it should also make you a little more aware of how aggressively and effectively the cilia are working. That when you're cold and that stuff's dripping out of your nose, normally all of that and a lot more is being drawn back actively through your sinus cavities, through your nasopharynx, down into your throat. That's kind of remarkable. That's just happening 24/7, keeping your airway clean. And so when it doesn't work quite as well and your nose drips, it should remind you of how well it works when your nose isn't dripping. So that is the basic function of at least the sinuses and the upper part of the airway that I want to talk about. The other point I want to make here as we kind of move our way down is that this airway isn't just protected from particulates, but it's protected from other kinds of pathogens, bacteria, and other things like that, as are all entryways to your body, right? Remember when we talked about the lymphatic system, we talked about how there are a lot more lymph nodes where there are openings to your body. And I think I even mentioned then that in your airway, there's a fair number of lymph nodes, and in your gastrointestinal system too, because those are basically places where stuff is kind of coming in from the outside, could have pathogens in it, so we need to take extra precautions in order to keep it clear. So when we look at that upper airway, what we see is a lot of lymph nodes. In fact, you know this. You just don't call them lymph nodes. You call them tonsils. And so what you talk about as tonsils, or maybe adenoids, are really more specifically called pharyngeal tonsils. And those are the tonsils in the back of your throat. And there's also palatine tonsils. And there's also lingual tonsils. And the lingual tonsils are at the base of your tongue. And there's eustachian tonsils, sometimes called tubal tonsils. And those are off to the sides toward your ears. Basically, what they're doing is creating a ring. And what this is called is Waldemeyer's ring. And Waldemeyer's ring is basically this circle of 8 different tonsils, which are functionally like lymph nodes, that are protecting your upper airway. Doesn't that make sense? I mean, you are taking in air at a massive quantity into your body. It totally makes sense that your body would develop a system to protect you against pathogens that come in through that major orifice, right? And that's exactly what happens. So Waldemeyer's ring is basically a collection of tonsils that create a circle around your upper airway, including pharyngeal tonsils, palatine tonsils, lingual tonsils, and eustachian tonsils. So you thought you only had 2 tonsils in your throat. Now you got a lot more than that. You're just more familiar with the pharyngeal tonsils or the adenoids because those are the ones that can become inflamed, especially as a child. And so from time to time they become so inflamed that they need to kind of be snipped off just to allow some clarity there. And what will happen is that part of that tonsil will regrow. It used to be the case back in the 50s and 60s when we were much more aggressive, where a lot of children, majority of children, routinely had those tonsils removed. Now we realize that those tonsils will usually recover from inflammation due to an illness and don't need to be aggressively removed. But nevertheless, that is a completely functional process. That is evolution doing its job, creating a really great protective barrier against all of those possible pathogens, bacteria, viruses, etc. They're going to come in from the 20,000 liters of air you're drawing into your body every day. Okay, the other protection is a protection you might not have thought of, but it should be kind of obvious, which is you need to protect your airway against all the stuff you're putting in your mouth. What I mean is you're eating and you're drinking. And have you ever wondered how is it that your body knows that when you drink Coke, it's supposed to go into your stomach, but when you breathe air, that's supposed to go into your lungs? Well, there's a process for that. And this diagram kind of shows it because it shows there the epiglottis. And you can think of the epiglottis as sort of a flap of durable connective tissue that basically blocks off the airway. It's part of the swallowing reflex, so that when you eat something, you chew it, you swallow it, your body senses this, and what will happen is that epiglottis will go down, it'll block your airway, it'll block the larynx, and therefore the food's going to go into the esophagus. And the esophagus is that pipe, which is basically just like a floppy kind of pipe, not a rigid open pipe, but a tube, a soft-walled tube where the food is going to go down. It's soft wall, it has smooth muscle around it, so it is capable therefore of moving that food down, which is, by the way, why you're capable of, say, swallowing when you're upside down or laying on your back or whatnot, because the smooth muscle around the esophagus is going to move it down. In front of the esophagus, as you can see from this image, is the trachea, and that's your airway, that's your pipe, and that is kept more open because you don't want to have to swallow air. So that actually has cartilage around it, which I'll talk about in a minute, that keeps that trachea open. So normally you breathe, as I'm breathing, in and out, no problems. But if I tried to swallow something, that epiglottis would close down, it would block off the larynx, and the uvula, that little dangly thing on the back of your throat, that would also block off the top. So therefore, whatever I swallow isn't going to go up into my sinuses. It's not going to go down into my trachea. It's going to go into my esophagus, and then the smooth muscles are going to work it down into my stomach. So that uvula, that dangly thing hanging down, is actually got a purpose there. It's to close off your nasopharynx and to protect you from that Coke spilling up in your nose. Now, I know sometime as a kid, you were probably laughing when you drank milk and you ended up squirting milk out of your nose, which caused you to laugh even more. Every kid's had that experience, right? What happened there? Well, you kind of messed up the coordination from your body, and this happens all the time. This is why people choke. When do people choke on food? They basically choke on food in social circumstances when they're trying to talk while eating. Why? Because your body's trying to deal with two demands here. You are eating stuff, and so therefore the epiglottis wants to close as part of the swallowing reflex to make sure the food goes into the esophagus, as we talked about. At the same time, you're trying to talk. And for you to talk, that airway has to be open so you can have air from the lungs come out and go through the larynx, hit the vocal cords, and make noise. So the epiglottis is at once trying to stay open while it's trying to stay closed. So if you keep talking while trying to eat, eventually you're going to lodge food in there and you're going to need that abdominal thrust maneuver to get that piece of hot dog out of your airway, right? So that's basically what's happening. Okay, as we move further down the airway, we get to the larynx. And the larynx is basically a set of cartilaginous, so basically cartilage, relatively firm. I hope you know what I mean by cartilage. If you don't, you kind of do, you just don't realize it. If you've had a baked chicken and you've seen that sort of somewhat rigid extension of the chicken's chest, or maybe the kind of plasticky looking material around the chicken's joints, it looks kind of like a white sort of plastic material, that's cartilage. It connects to bone, It allows joints to move more smoothly. It's like a smooth, more flexible version of bone. And that is basically the same sort of material that is here around your larynx, protecting your larynx. Why do you need that protection? Well, first off, you need a fairly rigid structure because that's how you're making noise. And if that were floppy, you wouldn't be able to control your voice very effectively. In addition, that is a vulnerable part of your airway, and you want that relatively protected. You don't want that to be floppy. You want that to be fairly significant. So it's connected, and as we go down into the trachea, those connections end up being sort of a C-shaped like this. That is, they're open in the back. Can you imagine why they're open in the back? I bet if I gave you a minute to think about it, you'd come up with it. They're open in the back because behind the trachea is the esophagus. And the esophagus, as I pointed out before, is like a floppy hose. It expands and smooth muscle moves food down as you swallow, right? It needs to be able to expand. So this C is open in the back to allow the esophagus to expand and allow that big old hot dog piece to go down into your stomach without interfering with your airway, right? We also have identified that as the Adam's apple, and it turns out that that's a more significant bit of cartilage in men than in women. So in men, we note that there's an Adam's apple. Does that mean there's no Adam's apple in women? Well, to be clear, there is absolutely a larynx in women. There's absolutely cartilage around that larynx in the same way, but it's usually not as prominent in female physiology. Okay, so from there, we go to the trachea. The trachea is about 16 to 20 stacked C-shaped cartilage pieces, right? This is kind of dense connective tissue, as I pointed out before. It's the plastic sort of semi-flexible tissue that's going to keep your trachea open, but be open in the back to allow the esophagus to expand when you need to swallow food. Okay, from there, it goes into the bronchioles, or the bronchi, I should say, initially. And here's an image for you. You can see there the larynx feeding into the bronchi, and from there into the bronchioles. And we call this whole system the bronchial tree. So basically what we've got then is the airway coming in here, it goes down here, and it divides, going into the lung tissue on either side. And it's going to divide into smaller and smaller bits. So these little red and blue dots here are meant to kind of represent that, I think. But you get the idea, and probably this image is probably a better image. So the bronchioles are the smaller version of the bronchi as they start to branch off. And they can get to about like 1 millimeter in diameter, and they're going to taper down from there into tiny and tiny little terminals. You could think of these bronchioles as sort of like the arterioles of your airway. What I mean by that is, if you remember when we talked about circulation, the arterioles came off of the arteries. They were smaller, branching off, and they were also, and this is important, the part that allowed for greater dilation and constriction, and therefore control of blood pressure and blood flow. That's what the arterioles do too. So they do not have cartilage around them as the bronchi, as the trachea, did. They actually are much more flexible so that they can open and close, and basically, like arterioles, the bronchioles can dilate and constrict to control airflow into your lung tissue. There's more than 1,000 of these terminal bronchioles in your lungs. So your lungs are going, that bronchial tree is going to have a lot of branches that are going to get tinier and tinier and tinier, kind of like a capillary bed there, but bringing air into your lungs, which are indeed a capillary bed. That is, coming in your lungs is blood, and that blood is going to have to connect with the airway. So what I mean by that is to take a step back here. What is the point of the lungs? The point of the lungs is to get air very close to blood so that the two can exchange gases. The oxygen in the air can seep into the blood, and the carbon dioxide in the blood can seep out into the air. So that's what's happening with this bronchial tree, is it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller to tiny little pathways, 1,000, more than 1,000 of these tiny little pathways that are controlling airflow and basically bringing air through these very thin-walled vessels, extremely close to your blood supply for the exchange of gases. Okay, in the bronchioles are also cilia. And here's an image of what that looks like, but also these fine hair-like fibers. And you can kind of imagine why they're there. And in that image, you can also see the goblet cells. And you remember that the goblet cells' point is to create mucus. Well, why do I want mucus in cilia in my bronchioles? The same reason. You're breathing in contaminants and you want those to work their way out. And they will. Those cilia will help. Those tiny little particles that get past the filtering mechanism of your sinuses, it'll allow those tiny little particles to work their way back up and out of the lungs. And what will happen then is periodically you will cough, because as it works its way back up, as the mucus works its way back up, it'll trigger a cough reflex and get that stuff to come out. You may not actually fully appreciate that it's coming out, because what it might do is pop up and then pop back down toward your stomach, as we talked about before, and you will swallow it, swallowing all these microorganisms or particulates that get trapped in the mucus, and they go into your stomach where the pH is so low that they're destroyed and are rendered harmless. Okay, so the other part of the airway then, or I should say of the respiratory system, is the blood part. That is to say, we've talked about the air coming in, and then we've got the blood coming in, and the two have to connect, and where they connect is the alveoli. And the alveoli are tiny little air sacs in your lungs. So all those bronchioles, as they get tinier and tinier and tinier, finally end with this image here, which is basically, you can look at it, it's almost like a grape cluster, right? This is basically a clump of tiny air sacs, very tiny air sacs, and that's where gas exchange happens. That's where the carbon dioxide moves out of the blood and the oxygen moves into the blood. Or if you'd like, this is where we oxygenate the blood. To put it in a big picture now, because I want you to be thinking broadly here, we already talked about the heart, right? The right side of the heart is pumping blood into the lungs. It goes then from the right side of the heart into the outside capillary bed around these alveoli. And you can see there in that image, you've got those blue lines. That's meant to represent the incoming deoxygenated blood. As a matter of convention and to some degree physiology, in medicine, deoxygenated blood is shown as blue and oxygenated blood is shown as red. In reality, I don't know that deoxygenated blood is all that blue, but certainly oxygenated blood tends to be a brighter red than deoxygenated blood. So deoxygenated blood comes into that capillary bed and surrounds these alveoli. The alveoli are filled with air and have very, very thin walls and very flexible. So they expand. When you breathe in, your bronchial tree brings air in. These alveoli ideally expand and open up with that incoming air. That makes close contact with the surrounding deoxygenated air brought in from those blue lines there in the image. That air becomes oxygenated. That is to say, there's only like one cell of a wall difference between, at this point, the blood and the air. So they are able to exchange gases as a result of that difference in partial pressure of gases. So basically, to step this back a bit, the proportion of oxygen in the atmosphere is higher than the proportion of oxygen in your blood, and the proportion of carbon dioxide in your blood is higher than the proportion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And these two want to equal out, almost like osmosis, but the result of a pressure in these two specific gases. In science, we call that partial pressure. Basically, like osmosis and fluid moving toward higher densities of particles, gases want to even out. So if you had two gases on either side of a membrane, and on one side it was 30% that a particular gas, and another percent was 5% that particular gas, and then the rest was air, the gas would want to move over to equalize that gradient, a partial pressure gradient. So the oxygen in your blood
wants to move through that tissue to equalize that gradient. There's a higher proportion of, the carbon dioxide in your blood wants to move outside to equalize that gradient. Whereas the oxygen in the air wants to move into your blood to equalize that gradient because there's less oxygen in your blood at this point, and there's more carbon dioxide in your blood than in the air at this point. So those two gases basically move over that thin wall of tissue. That, by the way, also should represent to you a bit of vulnerability. So at this point, you should appreciate why there's so many protective features to your airway, because now you've got this thin wall of tissue that is the difference between outside air that could have contaminants in it and your circulation and very sensitive tissue in your lungs. So any potential at that point pathogen, any bacteria, anything like that could create a pretty damaging infection, right? And could do some significant damage to tissue that's very fragile, very sensitive, right? Not to mention, it could get into your circulation. So you can see why your respiratory system needs these kinds of protections. Okay, so taking a step back now to put it all in place. We breathe in. The air comes in. It goes through the bronchial trees. It expands these grape-like clusters, these alveoli sacs, tiny little air sacs. These are surrounded by a capillary bed that is being provided deoxygenated blood from the right side of your heart. That blood exchanges gases with the air through the walls of the alveoli. Carbon dioxide leaves your blood. Oxygen comes into your blood. You then exhale, and what you exhale has more carbon dioxide in it and less oxygen in it, which is what you know. You know that you breathe in oxygen, you breathe out carbon dioxide. That's how it functions. That, to complete the cycle now, that oxygenated blood goes to the left side of your heart. And the left side of your heart is going to circulate that throughout your body, right? I should mention also there that there are alveoli pores, which, I think the image shows there. And those alveoli pores are just or alveolar pores, I should say, are just there to equalize pressure. So basically, so you don't have high pressure in some alveoli and lower pressure in others, basically just connects them together as a passageway to make sure you have equal pressure. Okay, given the vulnerability that we're talking about here, you're not surprised, I think, that there's going to be even more defenses than I've just described. We've already described an aggressive lymphatic ring that protects your airway. We've described the way the sinuses filter your air. We've described the creation of mucus through these goblet cells. We've described the cilia that bring all the particulates out to protect your airway. In addition to all that, in the alveoli, there are also alveolar macrophages. Do you remember what a macrophage is? The macrophage are those phagocytic defense cells. These are the large cells. You might remember that we called them monocytes when they're circulating through the blood, but usually they will find a home in tissue and hang out in that tissue as sort of the first responders, so that when you have an injury, when you have an inflammatory response, they're the ones that will initially start eating up whatever the pathogen, whatever the debris, damaged cells is in that area. Those are the macrophages. Well, it turns out there are macrophages that just hang out in the lungs. That's where they want to be. And their job is to clean up all the things you breathe in that don't get caught by the filtration system that exists before it. And in particular, this is really useful because small things can get through. So for example, your sinuses have initially hair in them, and then they have the mucous membranes, et cetera, that filter out all kinds of particles, right? The bigger the particle, the easier it is to filter out. And then you've got a gag reflex. So if you breathe in a lot of junk, you will cough and push some of that out. Here's the problem. Really tiny things don't trigger the gag reflex and go through the sinuses with less trouble. So these macrophages are really about dealing with those really tiny things. They're about dealing with the small little, whatever they are, protozoa or bacteria or other kinds of things that will get into your lung tissue and present a problem. And what they're going to do is identify them and gobble them up. They're specialized cells in your lungs whose job is to keep your lungs clear of debris and potential pathogens. There's another interesting feature in the lung tissue, which are specialized alveolar cells. So most cells are just like I talked about, the alveoli cells, and their job is basically just to help you with oxygenation of the blood. But there's something called type 2 cells, and their job is a little different. Their job is to secrete surfactants. And those surfactants, you may have heard that term before, but they are there to break up the surface tension in the fluid in the lungs, in the mucus in the lungs, to allow the alveoli to do their job. How does this work? Well, imagine it this way. If you had, how should I say this? Okay, taking a step back, what is a surfactant? We use surfactants as an example to deal with oil spills. So if an oil rig spills a lot of oil in the water, we try to clean some of that up, scrape it off the top of the water, but then what we'll also do potentially is spray on surfactants. And these are like detergents that break apart the surface tension of the oil and allow it therefore to dissipate out. It's, in my view, a bad policy, but basically, as is often said, the solution to pollution is dilution. In this case, it allows the oil to be isolated as tiny little particles that then go out into the water. What it's doing there is it's breaking up the surface tension. Here's an image to give you an idea of what I mean by surface tension, in case you haven't heard of this before. Have you ever filled up a glass of water so high that basically it creates a bulbous form on top of the glass? That's the water holding itself together. Or maybe what you've seen is droplets of water, maybe on a freshly polished car, for example, and the droplets sort of have a bulbous shape to them. And you think to yourself, oh, that's good polish because that's making the water bulb up. Yep. What it did is it's creating a smooth surface that is allowing the water's proclivity to hold itself together to effectively create a separate drop. What is that proclivity? What I mean is this. Water has a polarized charge to it. H2O is polarized. One side is somewhat negative, one side is somewhat positive, which is good because it means the molecules interact together. But it also means that when you have water all together, it pulls in together. That is, those negatives and positives interact with each other and they create a surface. And that surface separates it from the surrounding air. That's what a water droplet is. Okay, so far no problem. Here's the problem. If that happens in a very small, microscopic kind of way, that surface tension becomes extremely powerful. I think we talked about this before when we talked about an air embolism. An air embolism is kind of the same thing. It's the surface tension of the air surrounded by the water, but it has the same kind of an effect. So much so that if you have a little bit of an air bubble in your circulatory system and it gets down to a very, very small capillary bed, it's just going to block it. You would think, why doesn't that just dissolve? Because the surface tension is such that it's got like the pressure capacity of a ball bearing because it's a tiny little thing. The smaller it gets, the more that effect has. Another way of thinking about this is like this. Have you ever blown bubbles? Like blown bubbles? If you blow really small bubbles, they look spherical. They're very small, very tight. They last a long time. If you blow a really big bubble, like with one of those big bubble rings, you get a really long bubble that's all warbly. It doesn't have much surface tension to it, or it has the same surface tension, but it's distributed. So it doesn't have a firm surface tension to it. Whereas those small bubbles had a pretty firm tension to them. Okay, why am I covering all of this? Well, because it ends up being a very important part of respiration, because in respiration, you got air and fluids. So you have that interaction of surface tensions. And if you don't have some way of breaking up that surface tension, some surfactant that breaks up that surface tension, then you're going to have real problems because those alveoli are not going to be able to function. They won't be able to open readily. They won't be able to absorb air. The air won't be able to get through that fluid that in the membrane very easily. So the surfactants are meant basically to allow the passage of air through moist tissue and through those very small alveoli that have a surface covered in moisture. That's why it's so important that you have surfactants. Does this matter much? Am I making a big deal out of nothing? It matters a lot. In fact, it is the principal challenge of preemie babies. So preterm babies, babies that are born, let's say at, 25, 26 weeks, frequently their primary life-threatening issue is respiratory. And the reason for that is that they don't have adequate surfactants. Before the baby's born, their lungs are filled with fluid, amniotic fluid. That's what's in their lungs. They aren't filled with air. There is no air. They are in the womb. Once they come out, then that fluid has to be absorbed and removed, and then they have to be able to breathe. And that happens pretty quickly. And it happens with the help of surfactants. But if a baby comes out too early, it doesn't have that surfactant capacity. So that baby will immediately suffer potentially life-threatening respiratory distress, which is why when you have a preemie baby, one of the first things we do is we take a tube and we put surfactant into the baby's airway to hopefully help that baby clear the fluids and be able to breathe. That's the thing. It allows then the air passages to open up as the fluid no longer has this firm skin to it or tension to it, but it's able to open up and allow the passage of air through the airway. Okay, so that's the importance of surfactant. Okay, so then to complete our image here, in terms of the lungs, we've got the alveoli, we've got incoming blood that comes in through, just to remind you, the pulmonary artery. So the pulmonary artery is delivering blood for oxygenation. So that's interesting, by the way, because that's an artery because it's coming from the heart, but it's an artery that doesn't have oxygenated blood. All the other arteries have oxygenated blood coming from the heart. This one, because it's coming from the right side of the heart into the lungs, has deoxygenated blood. That branches multiple times as it goes through the bronchi, and it creates a capillary bed, a network of capillary passageways around the alveoli that produces the gas exchange. This is just a review. We've talked about all this. Carbon dioxide, because there's less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there is in the blood. Carbon dioxide travels from the blood into the atmosphere. Oxygen, because there's more oxygen in the airway than in the blood. Oxygen travels from the air into the blood. That's what we call partial pressure gradient. The pressure of different gases want to equalize themselves out across any kind of membrane like that. That is breathing. That's it. Let's take a bigger picture, though, before we finish up here with the lungs so we can see what's going on. We've got two lungs, as you know. Took one out here on the other side. In between those two lungs is the heart. Will you go back in? There we go. There's the heart right there. As I mentioned before, it's basically in the center of your chest, slightly to the left, right? It's not, not over here where folks imagine it to be. Okay. On the right side, the lung has 3 lobes to it. On the left side, the lung has 2 lobes to it. In utero, it begins with 3 lobes and then develops into 2 lobes. Why? To make space for the heart. You can see that there's this space here, basically, where the lung on the left opens up and allows some space for the heart. I should also mention another characteristic of the lungs that is a lot like the heart, which is the lungs move, but the surrounding tissue doesn't move as much. Remember, the heart pumps, and we pointed out that it's pumping in the thoracic cavity right here, and it's in a bag that's in a bag with a pleural fluid between the two. Remember we talked about that? Pericardium. The pericardium allows the relative movement of the heart to the surrounding tissue without causing the two to rub up against each other or otherwise create a problem. The lungs have the same issue. You're breathing in and out. You expand your lungs, contract your lungs, expand your lungs, contract your lungs. You know this, right? And you might ask the question, why doesn't that hurt? Maybe you've never asked that question, but you should. Like, why are the lungs not attaching to my muscle tissue surrounding them and causing strain every time I breathe in and breathe out? You might have experienced some pleurisy. That is, at some point, did you maybe breathe in and you noticed, like a little stitch, and you thought, oh, that kind of hurts. And then you breathed in a little bit more and it hurt a little more. And the more you breathed in, the harder the more pain it had. Basically, you had to force yourself to breathe in kind of firmly, and then it stretched it and that pain went away. Imagine if that were the way you had to breathe all the time. What happened there is perhaps some of the pleural fluid be around your lungs just basically kind of didn't allow the kind of lubrication, and so it created a kind of a little bit of a bind there that had to be stretched out with a couple of firm inhalations. Okay, so what is surrounding your lungs is what's called a pleura. And basically this is just like in your heart. It's a double-lined sac, and in the middle of that is a fluid that allows the relative motion of your lungs to the surrounding tissue. So your lungs are surrounded by a tissue bag that is filled with fluid that's viscous, and that fluid allows the relative movement without causing the two to adhere to each other. As you can see here from this image, you basically just got an inner, what we call a visceral pleura, and then an outer layer. Doesn't really matter. We're not that worried in this class about the precise definitions. If you're going to be a doctor or a nurse, you'll have to memorize that later. But in between the two is a viscous fluid that allows the relative motion and therefore avoids pain every time you inspire, every time you breathe in or breathe out. Okay, that's basically the mechanical functions of the lungs. And then in the next video, we're going to be going through with a little more detail oxygenation, gas exchanges and other things, and as well as in future videos, some of the dysfunctions that happen in the respiratory system. So I'll see you then.